A predator found a dying foal in the snow. Eyes unfocused, leg broken. No one came, not even his mother. But instead of killing, the predator sat down. No growl, no roar, just stillness, as if it too had once been abandoned. This isn't a rescue, not a fairy tale, not a myth told by firelight. It's a warning that not everything in the wild comes to kill. Some come to remember, and what they remember is who we used to be before we forgot how to stay. Stay till the end, because some souls don't come to survive. They come to remind us who really died a long time ago. 3 days ago, Lorian was born in a shallow rock hollow, hidden among ancient tree roots on the outer edge of the Calethorn Range. His mother, Solon, a seasoned mare who had lost 2 foals to the harsh winters before, had chosen that place believing it safe. But nothing is safe when the snow comes early. The storm struck without warning. Wind howled through every crack in the forest, snow surged like a wave. The larger horses stampeded, hoofs thundering in panic. Solon turned her head only once, her eyes flickering between herd instinct and maternal pull. And then, like something tore through her heart, she ran. Lorian was thrown from her side. He tumbled down a rocky slope. Tiny hoofs scraped stone, slid through mud. No whinny. No cry. No one turned back. When he finally stopped, only the wind howled, and blood soaked into the earth. His vision blurred, his chest rose and fell like a dying ember. One hind leg twisted unnaturally, swelling purple. His thin belly was caked in mud and frostbitten slush. Blood trickled from his mouth, hardening into a cracked crust around his lips. The wind whipped harder with each gust. Lorian lay on his side, eyes open but unfocused. He tried to lift his head. Couldn't. The soft, newborn neck was far too weak. All he could see was snow. Bare. Silent. No sound of hooves. No voices. Just breath, cracking like dried leaves. And in that moment when most creatures surrender, Lorian was still breathing. Not because he hoped, but because instinct had not yet died. The forest gave no warning. Just one sound tearing through the frozen air, the snap of a branch. Then the ground trembled slightly. Snow dropped from tree limbs as if startled. A massive black shadow emerged from the gray mist. Kale. An old gray bear. Towering. Hunched back. Scarred shoulders that read like a war map. Each step sank the earth. His thick coat clumped with ice and hardened sleet, coarse like gravel. His eyes, no longer bright, but not blind. They held something quieter than death itself, as though they had seen too many endings to believe in what humans called closure. Kale didn't rush. He moved past fallen logs, nostrils flaring. He didn't hunt. He didn't growl. But everything on him, from yellow teeth to claws curved like scythes, spoke the same truth: he could kill at any moment. Then he saw Lorian. A trembling thing, too broken to move. In a moment where even time seemed to hold its breath, the wind hissed through the trees and Kale stopped. His eyes fixed on the dying creature. He didn't blink. Didn't move. As if the entire world froze between two beings, one on the edge of life, the other with the power to end it. One strike of his paw, done. Blood on snow. And the world would not blink. But Cale didn't strike. He let out a low growl. Not a threat, but a breath from somewhere deep inside, a sound that carried the weight of a soul that had been exiled and was, somehow, remembering itself. He lowered his head, never breaking eye contact with Lorien. One step, then another. Then he stopped. 10 paces away, he stood still, as if waiting for the world to answer a single question. Is anyone still watching? Or have we all turned away? And in that space, only 2 sounds remained, the heavy breathing of an ancient beast, and the weak, cracking breath of a life that had never learned what it meant to truly live. The silence came suddenly, like the forest itself had realized something sacred was unfolding and dared not interrupt. Snow changed direction, falling slower, heavier, like a white veil draping over the final moments of a fragile soul. Cale stepped closer. No longer a predator. No longer the shadow of danger. Each step was heavy, as if weighed down by memories too old to name. He didn't look directly at Lorien anymore. Instead, he looked just past him, as if he saw another shape once lying there, and another lifetime also left behind. Lorien stirred slightly. His eyes barely opened, glazed with exhaustion. He saw the enormous shadow beside him, and something strange happened. There was no fear. No trembling. No shrinking away. No wild cry for help. He just lay there, as if he had already accepted the end. Or perhaps, as if some ancient instinct in his tiny soul could feel something beyond the surface, something in the giant approaching wasn't coming to end him. Cale sat down. Not a sound. Snow began to gather across his back, but he didn't shake it off. He didn't seek shelter. He didn't look for food. He simply sat, quiet, watching, or maybe sharing. No one could tell. Minutes passed like hours. Then, slowly, Cale lay down beside the foal. His massive frame curled gently, like an ancient stone resting on the edge of a cliff. His broad back brushed against the foal's side, just enough for warmth to transfer. There were no words, no sounds, no barriers. Just 2 bodies, one worn down by time, one barely begun, lying together in the stillness of a frozen night. Cale closed his eyes, ears twitching with every gust of wind. Lorien breathed more steadily. Not because he was stronger, but because he was no longer alone. And beneath a sky where snow fell without a sound, where everything living seemed to hold its breath, only 2 souls remained. One who had seen the end of too many things, and one who had yet to learn what it means to be loved. Sharing the final hours, as if they had known each other in another life. The next morning, the wind had calmed, but the snow remained thick. Faint tracks marked the cold, packed earth, guiding him closer to the edge of the forest. Micah Rourke, once the head of a wildfire response unit, now a ranger tracking the movements of wild mustangs through the mountain highlands, had felt something was wrong after the 3rd night of storms. He had seen too many deaths in his time. But this morning, when his boots crunched to a stop on a clearing of untouched snow, something inside him just halted. A foal. Motionless. Coated in crusted blood and frozen mud, its chestnut coat dull and broken. The body looked as though the storm had defeated it from the inside out. But what stopped Micah's heart was the shape lying right beside it. A gray bear, Not hunting, not hiding, just lying there like a living shield between the foal and the world. Eyes half closed. A massive frame relaxed, not because it was tired, but because it had chosen not to fight. Micah froze. He had faced bears before, in fire and smoke. He had seen horses torn apart on rock ledges. But never this. He took a half step back, instinctively. One hand rested on the grip of his sidearm, not to draw it, but to anchor himself in the shock. But he didn't pull the weapon, because the bear didn't move. And Lorian, though his gaze was faint, had opened his eyes, looking up at Micah not with panic, but something else. A silent call for help. And yet, not from fear. Micah stood in place. The wind sliced through his coat like knives of ice, but he barely noticed. Everything he knew, his training, his instincts, the old stories of burned seasons past, was erased in that one frozen moment by something sacred, something he couldn't name. He knelt, eye level with the trembling creature. He could hear every fractured breath. And then, softly, not to the bear, not to the sky, but to himself, Micah whispered, "God, this isn't something they teach you in school." The bear opened his eyes. No growl, no flinch, just a gaze that pierced flesh, as if asking whether this man was worthy of stepping into a moment nature had already ordained. Micah didn't move closer. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't call for backup. He simply stood, silent, bearing witness. Because in nearly 3 decades in the wild, this was the first time. He felt he was looking at a miracle. And this miracle didn't shine. It didn't roar. It radiated only one thing: warmth. From an old beast, cradling the fading soul of something that the world had already forgotten. Some wounds don't bleed, but they gnaw at every breath. Before becoming a silent shadow in the deep woods, Cale once had a name in the language of the wind. A full-grown male bear, once ruling over a territory broader than 10 valleys, walking tall among deer no one dared to challenge. He hadn't always been alone. Her name was Elsha. A female bear with pale copper fur, shimmering like summer grass in the sun. They had spent 3 snow seasons together, sharing the scent of blood, of fur, the quiet nights curled in caves like 2 sleeping mountains. Then humans came, with steel, smoke, and sounds that did not belong in the forest. One night, Elsha followed the scent of meat rising from a crevice. A trap. Precise. Placed exactly where bear tracks had once appeared. And the scream she let out, Cale would never forget it, rang like nails driven into his skull. He charged. But it was too late. She was dragged away. Not by teeth, but by laughter. Cale rammed through, his shoulder tearing open as it struck barbed wire. But Elsha's figure, bound to the back of a pickup truck, vanished into the morning mist. Since then, Cale no longer roared. Nor did he sleep deeply. He didn't kill humans. But if he smelled gunpowder, he would quietly retreat. Not out of fear, but because he knew humans didn't understand how the forest loved. Cale survived. But he didn't live. And elsewhere, on that same mountain range, a man lived the same way, carrying a wound no one could see, yet one that never stopped bleeding. Micah Rourke once had hands as firm as mountain stone, and a heart as soft as smoke. That year, he was 32, head of a federal wildfire response team, leading through an unprecedented blaze in the Gallows End Valley. Amid the choking smoke and roaring fuel canisters, he spotted a herd of wild horses driven toward a cliff edge. He didn't shoot. He shouted, screamed until his throat tore, hoping to push them back. One mare turned, a foal trotting behind her. A flicker of hope sparked in Micah's chest. Maybe there was still time. But then, a snap. A tree falling. And in that flash of primal survival, Micah pulled the trigger. Not a tree. The mare. She collapsed. No scream. No struggle. The foal ran. Lost. And amid the roar of fire, as the wind scattered the scent of smoke, Micah stood there, hollow. The rescue team arrived. But he couldn't stand. His legs buckled as if broken from within. The report read, self-defense discharge. But Micah wrote instead, that was the day I stopped believing I could save anyone. He told no one. Offered no defense. Just quietly disappeared from the federal records. He withdrew to the woods. Took a ranger post in the highlands. No one asked about his past. He never answered. Only the wind remained. And a few wild horses still drank at the old stream each season. Every time he saw them lower their heads, it was like something gripped his chest. Because in the blend of wind and water, there was always a broken whinny. A sound only he could still hear. And then, that afternoon, when the sky began to dim behind gray treetops, a different sound echoed. Unlike anything Micah had heard. Not wind. Not forest. But a wild, low rumble that froze every cell in his body. It tore through memory and pulled him back to the present. That afternoon, the wind changed. Micah was tending a fire a mile away when a roar shattered the silence from a hill beyond. Not Cale. Not the weary breath of an old forest. This one was younger. Sharper. Like a blade. A signal that something unnatural was coming, to break the fragile balance that still held. A black bear emerged from the blurred edge of the deep woods. Enormous. Its fur dark as wet coal, muscles rolling like undercurrents beneath the skin. Its eyes held no question. Only hunger. And youth. Cale stepped from the shadows without pause. Placed himself between the threat and Lorien, once more, becoming a shield. He didn't roar. But his body rose like a stone mountain. Shoulders high. Fur bristled. Each breath a warning to the forest, someone here was ready to die. The wind halted. Birds silenced. Trees stood frozen. Then, like a silent detonation, the battle exploded. Not just a fight, but a clash of generations, two survival philosophies, two worlds. The black bear lunged like a rebellious arrow of nature. Claws slashed tree bark into splinters. Cale dodged, twisted, and struck back with a paw that sent snow into a blizzard. Roars echoed through the gorge. Earth cracked. Blood spattered like ink on snow. Cale staggered, but did not fall. He roared, a deep, fractured sound, as if carving into stone a vow never spoken. I will not let it happen again. The black bear roared back. But it was the scream of youth, ignorant of fear, blind to loss. It charged, and the two collided like thunder clashing in a silenced forest. Micah heard it all. The tearing wind. The shattering snow. Blood dripping on raw flesh. And he ran. Without thinking. Without knowing what he was doing. His old legs chose for him, toward death, toward what he once failed to protect. Cale was slammed down. The earth shook beneath the blow. One shoulder torn open, blood staining the snow, breath ragged. The young black bear shrieked, wild, breath steaming like fire. It wasn't hunting anymore. It was punishing. Micah scrambled down the slope, each step a battle with gravity. No room for reason. Only instinct. He ran toward Lorien like diving into the eye of a storm. The foal lay motionless, like a clump of earth in the forest. Blood slowed at his nostrils. Eyes half closed, awaiting the final blow. The black bear bared its teeth. Eyes burning red. It lunged. And Cale, bleeding, rose. One step. Two. Then a roar. Not a common roar, but a call from the depths of memory. A bell tolling for everything he had ever lost. A line drawn between surviving and protecting. The charge stopped the young beast cold. Two bodies collided, snow burst skyward. Wind spun. Trees groaned. And in that fleeting moment, Micah grabbed Lorien and fled the kill zone. When he turned back, Cale did not pursue. Did not roar. Did not follow. He stood still, watching. Not because he gave up, but because Cale understood some lives, at a certain point, must be passed on to another pair of hands. The sky blurred in shades of gray as the last helicopter lifted off the ridge. The wind from its blades still echoed faintly, blowing thin snow from the treetops. Micah sat beside Lorien, his hand never leaving the thick blanket wrapped around the colt's fragile body. They had arrived at the Whisper Hollow Wildlife Rescue Center, a rare place where compassion still existed between the wild and humankind. Veterinarians received Lorien at the door. They didn't ask many questions. One glance at Micah, his face caked with dried blood, his expression hollow, and they simply nodded. One of them placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, just enough to say, "It's our turn now." Micah stood silent in that moment, as if his heart were being pulled from his chest with each step Lorien was wheeled away. Part of him wanted to hold on. But another part knew, for Lorien to live, he had to let go. Lorien was taken into intensive care. Harsh white lights cast down on his chestnut coat, now pale and dull. The wound on his leg had been bandaged, fluids were being administered intravenously, and the beeping of the heart monitor ticked on like a clock counting the seconds of survival. But for the first 3 days, Lorien refused to eat. Refused to drink. His eyes would only stare blankly at the ceiling, or shut again, as if living in another reality no one else could reach. The vets grew anxious. They tried everything: goat milk, electrolyte water, steamed young grass. Nothing worked. Only one thing kept that heartbeat from slipping into a flat line: Micah. He stayed there, hardly ever leaving the recovery room. A doctor offered him a chair. He declined. He sat on the floor against the wall, eyes fixed on the fragile creature before him. Every time Lorien gasped, Micah breathed with him. Every time Lorien twitched in his sleep, he whispered something, words not of comfort, but stories from another time, ones only two wounded souls could understand. On the third night, a nurse gently suggested, "You should go home and rest." Micah replied, "I left once before. A horse didn't wait for me that time." Mountain nights are colder than city ones, even in spring. Wind hissed through the cracks, and stars shimmered faintly behind a thin veil of mist, as if something was still waiting. Micah stayed awake almost the entire night. He didn't sleep, just sat there, one hand resting close to Lorian's muzzle, so he'd know if the colt stirred. And stir he did. Not much. But in the heavy slumber brought by drugs and exhaustion, the foal would twitch, his shoulder jerking slightly, a hind leg drawing up like he was galloping. Once, he let out a faint whinny, just distorted breath, but inside it, a name. No one else understood. But Micah did. Cale. He clenched the hand resting on the blanket. Not in surprise, but because something electric ran up his spine. That name wasn't taught. It wasn't learned, it was summoned. Lorian was still searching. Though his body had been rescued, his soul was still running somewhere in the woods, where life and death had yet to draw their line. Micah remembered Cale's eyes when he turned away. Not accusing. Not demanding. Just a look, as if to say, if he calls, let him know. I'm still here. And then, deep in Micah's mind, another image surfaced, the eyes of the mare from long ago, turning back through the blaze to search for her foal. That time, he couldn't save the life. But maybe this time, he had done the right thing. The fifth night. No moon, but wind. And through a darkness heavy as a stone upon the forest's chest, Micah heard something, soft, deliberate. Not human. Not predator. He left the recovery room, walking slowly across the wooden hallway, boots creaking softly on the planks. A vet on night duty looked up and nodded. Micah answered with a nod of his own, then stepped outside. The backyard of the rescue station was empty. But he didn't look toward the yard. He looked at the tree line. There stood a shadow, completely still, nearly blending with the trees, but unmistakable. Cale. The bear didn't come closer. Didn't cross the fence. Didn't growl. He simply stood there, like a living statue, watching the yellow light glowing from the recovery window. His eyes flickered, like faded stars. Micah didn't call. Didn't approach. He stood still, hand on the door, as if to keep some invisible balance intact. And inside the room, Lorian opened his eyes. He didn't stand. Didn't whinny. But for the first time in nearly a week, he didn't look at the ceiling, he looked at the door. Micah's heart skipped. He was looking. Not at him, but at the figure outside. A thread, not rope, not leash, but something only souls who had once breathed beneath the same snow could weave. Lorian breathed deeper. The monitor's beeps steadied. By morning, Cale was gone. Micah came out early, shadows still under his eyes from a week of sleepless nights. He stood before the woods for a long time, hands by his sides, calling nothing, hoping for nothing, just waiting for something unnamed. There was no roar. No tracks. Only a few leaves twirling on the breeze, like a quiet goodbye. He turned back. Lorian was standing, unsteady, but standing. The vet said, "He's eating now." Not much, but eating. Micah said nothing. He walked over, placed a hand on the colt's mane, and stroked gently. Lorian looked at him. Didn't flinch. Didn't search. But didn't lean in either. Micah understood. He was learning something no one could teach, how to keep living, without clinging to what once saved you. And in that moment, Micah knew he no longer needed to stay. On the window ledge, a single late-season leaf fell, softly and still, as if the wind had carried away the last thing that needed holding. Not because Lorien had forgotten Cale, but because he had remembered, deep enough to carry it with every breath from now on. That morning, the sky was a pale silver sheet stretched quietly over the hilltops. A thin layer of mist blanketed the meadow, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath for something inevitable. The transport truck rolled to a stop at the edge of the wildlife preserve. No revving engine, just the crunch of gravel beneath wheels and the hush of wind slipping through knee-high grass. Micah stood by the open rear gate. Inside the trailer, Lorien stood tall. His coat had regained its sheen, a blend of white and chestnut. His eyes were no longer clouded, though something in them remained both distant and familiar. "You ready?" Micah whispered, not expecting a reply. He didn't lead Lorien out. No rope. No whip. No commands. Just an open path leading into the endless wilderness. Lorien hesitated. One step forward, then still. He sniffed the air. Ears flicked. Every movement deliberate, as if each inch of earth ahead held a hidden danger. Then, he stepped out. Morning light struck his back, revealing veins beneath skin still tight from recovery. There were no cheers. No fairy tale reunion. Just a once frail colt, now standing firm, in a meadow far too wide. And no one there to welcome him. They came from the south, shadows stretching long in the new sun. 6 of them, a small band, led by a tall silver-gray mare. Her eyes were cold and clever, seasoned by too many winters. Lorien turned at the sound of hooves. His eyes lit up by instinct. He inhaled deeply, swallowed his nerves, and stepped forward, head bowed, ears flat, body saying, "I come in peace." The lead mare advanced. Proud strides, every muscle visible beneath her glistening coat. She stopped within one stride of him. Her eyes locked onto his. She reached forward and sniffed. Then, her neck snapped upright. A sharp snort burst from her nostrils. Her mane flared like bristled quills. And without warning, she whipped her neck hard. Lorien fell. Not hurt, but humiliation bruised deeper than any blow. He scrambled to his feet, lowered his head again, tried once more. A stallion from the group shrieked. A sound of ownership. Of warning. He charged, hoofs flinging mud, rearing up and crashing down inches from Lorien's face, a warning strike. A hair closer, and blood would have spilled. Lorien flinched backward. Ears upright, eyes wide. Not in fear, but confusion. He'd survived ice, blood, the shadow of a bear. But here, the place he believed would be home, was the first to cast him out. Smells of medicine. Of humans. Of bear. Sense of something other. The herd turned away. No glance back. No explanation. Just rejection, cold and final. Lorien ran. Not toward anything, just away. His old wound flared, rear leg stumbling. But he kept running, through thorns, slicing grass, across the shallow stream, slipping down slopes, escaping the one thing that could undo all survival, being forgotten. Behind him, the herd vanished into silence. Like stone. No one followed. No voice called him back. Farther off, at the edge of the old forest, a dark figure sat silently among moss-covered trees, motionless, but not absent. Cale. He didn't approach, didn't roar, didn't interfere with a life trying to begin anew. He just sat there, like a relic of stone, a quiet guardian between what must be held and what must be let go. From where he was, nothing escaped him. He saw Lorien fall, not from weakness, but from lacking the scent of belonging. He saw him rise again, no screaming, no resistance, just walking away. That silent departure cracked even the heart of the forest. Cale's eyes no longer blazed, but a fire still burnt, quiet, undying. A gaze that didn't need words. A silent blessing sent with stillness. Lorien didn't look back. Maybe he didn't know. Or maybe he did. But for the first time, he chose not to. And Cale remained seated. Didn't roar to call him back. Didn't smash the world as instinct once taught. He simply stayed, a silent pillar for another's path to begin. If this was the price of growth, to move on without the eyes that once watched over you, he accepted it. Because if anyone was meant to wait in the shadows so a young soul could walk through light alone, it was him. Evening fell over the forest like a deep-colored blanket pulled over the world. The wind shifted, carrying hints of iron and decay. Cale rose from the mossy earth, shoulders heavy like carved stone. He was ready to leave. Then, he froze. A sound, sharp, high, slicing the silence like a blade. Not deer. Not fox. A snarl, not deep, but whistling. Thin and precise like a hunter's string just released. Cale turned. Eyes narrowed. There, on the rocky slope, a shape emerged, slender, lethal, moving like an arrow aimed at the forest's heart. A mountain lion. Lean, fast. Its fur hugged tight over sinewy muscle, every move taut as a drawn bowstring. Eyes like molten brass, brimming with hunger and raw intent. Breath hissed through bared teeth, echoing years of unquenched craving. And its gaze, fixed. Toward the meadow where Lorien wandered. Cale didn't growl. Didn't back down. He stepped forward. One step. Then another. Slow. Certain. The grass bent beneath him as if knowing this was nature's line in the sand. This wasn't instinct. Nor territory. It was something sacred that stirred inside Cale's chest. The time had come. One final time. No voice called him. No eye saw him. But in the dusk wind, between two lives never meant to meet, there was something only the broken dare do. To turn back, not for themselves, but for what comes next. Cale gave a low growl. A farewell prayer. Then he moved, faster. Stronger. Without looking back. For where he was going, no witness was needed. Next morning, Micah returned to the meadow. Not from habit, nor instinct, but something between longing and knowing, a thread tugging him back. The grass still glistened with dew. The sky dull gray. The air off. Heavy. As if a vow had been spoken and buried. A streak of blood. Small, but deep red, like something gave too much to save just enough. Micah bent down. His heart clenched beyond thought. Fingers brushed the soil. Cold. Wet. Shaking. He followed the trail. Past split brambles, down a muddied stream, to a mossy clearing, where Kale once kept watch. No one there. Only strands of gray fur caught on thorns. A broken claw, bloodied. And a long, deep drag mark, as if a great body had been pulled, silently, away. No carcass. No scream. No tracks clear enough to follow. Only silence. A silence too loud. Not from absence, but from someone choosing not to leave a trace. Micah stood for a long time. In his hand, a single blood-stained bare hair, rough, cold. His heart didn't shatter, but something inside emptied forever. He didn't cry. Didn't shout. Just stood, the lone witness to something wholly slipping out of this world. Then he whispered, not sure to whom. Maybe the wind. Maybe himself. Maybe to a soul now vanished. And sometimes, to protect a life, one must step into the dark without asking anyone to watch. And a moment later, the wind swept the hilltop, carrying the scent of the forest, along with something that felt like a thank you. Dusk fell like a memory. The clearing shimmered in the fading gold, and Lorien stood at its edge, his hoofs steady, his frame taller, though the silence of rejection still whispered through the lines of his body. From the ridgeline came a sound like breath held too long, hoofbeats, slow and certain. A lone mare approached. She bore the age of seasons in her graying coat, her stance calm, deliberate. There was no pride in her walk, only presence. The wisdom of having once been the one left behind. Lorien didn't move. His chest rose, then fell. Eyes fixed, not in defiance, but in quiet readiness. The mare stopped in front of him. No sniff. No snort. Just a simple motion, her muzzle pressed gently to his neck. Not dominance. Not curiosity. Something older than both. Then she turned and walked on. But not alone. The herd, as if summoned by a silence only they understood, followed. And this time, Lorien walked among them. Not trailing. Not begging. With them. No voices marked the moment. But beneath his hooves, the snow softened, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement. It had always waited for him. The next morning broke gently, cloaked in a hush that made the forest feel like it was still holding its breath. Micah returned once more to whisper hollow, not with urgency, but with something more fragile, hope threaded with grief. He walked the familiar trail, past where the truck had once parked, past the clearing where Lorien had once stood alone. By the river's bend, beside the frozen pool, he saw them. A set of tracks. Massive. Singular. Bare prints. Fresh. Deep. Leading to the water and disappearing. Nothing else. No claw marks. No blood. Just those prints. As if the forest had briefly opened itself for one last crossing, and then closed behind him forever. Micah knelt by the water, fingers brushing against the frozen edge of the track. It was larger than he remembered, deeper, as though Kale had carried more than just his body through this place. He rested his palm in the depression. It was cold, yes, but it throbbed faintly with something else. A memory. A presence not yet gone. He didn't cry, but his throat tightened. "You made it," he whispered. And in that whisper, there was more than acknowledgement. There was a goodbye. Micah stayed there a while longer, watching the still surface of the pool, hoping and not hoping for a ripple. But nothing came. Just wind in the pines, and the weight of a story only he would remember in full. Years passed. The Whisper Hollow cabin aged slowly beneath the weight of snow and story. And still, young rangers came, boots caked in mud, minds buzzing with rules, but hearts wide open. They'd sit in a rough circle, steam rising from tin mugs, pens clutched loosely in gloved hands. Eyes curious, ready for another tale. And Micah, older now, hair silver, voice like wind through pine, would pour his coffee slow, steady. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. Not everything out here is what it seems, he'd begin, the fire reflecting in his eyes. These woods will test you. Some days you'll be terrified. Other days you'll wonder if you belong here at all. A pause. A longer sip. The fire crackling filled the space where no one dared interrupt. But then, he continued, you'll see something. It won't be loud. It won't be obvious. But it'll stop you in your tracks. It won't fit any manual. And it'll never leave you. He'd lean back, the cane across his lap, eyes far away now. Not all creatures out here are beasts. Some are ancient souls, too quiet for the textbooks, too sacred for science. Sent back not to survive, but to protect what the world gave up on. And that was when the forest seemed to lean in. No one asked what he meant. No one needed to. Because some truths don't need explaining. They just need silence to bloom. And in that silence, the fire never flickered once. There was no final cry. No paw prints to follow. Just a still forest, and one soul standing where no one waited anymore. Micah never saw Kale again. But on windlashed nights, when the storm swept through the cliffs, he would sit by the window, unmoving, listening. Sometimes, in the gaps between gusts, he thought he heard it. A breath. Low. Deep. Not from lungs, but from memory. The woods were remembering. Not all wild things come to kill. Some old souls, with nothing left to lose, choose to protect what the world has long turned its back on. Not all wounds need bandages. Some are healed by presence. By those who choose not to leave. Not all legends need words. Some stories only need to be believed and carried, quietly, in the hearts of those who were once saved. And if you've ever felt like a soul the world forgot, then know this, if even once, someone paused for you, you're worth continuing. And sometimes, that alone can save the world. Share with someone who needs this story. Like if your heart paused for just a beat. Send it to someone whose faith needs mending. Subscribe to Gallop of Glory, because the next story might be the one that saves you too.